Welcome to Country Roll, a special Let It Roll maxi series discussing Ken Burns' country music documentary hosted by Nate Wilcox and James Porter. Follow the Let It Roll podcast on Twitter at Let It Rollcast and check out our website at letitrollpodcast.com. Let It Roll is a Pantheon podcast, and you can listen to more great podcasts at www.pantheonpodcast.com. Nate uses AKG microphones and headphones. Today, Nate and James discuss Episode 4, I Can't Stop Loving You, which covers Nashville's struggles to adapt to the sudden emergence of rockabilly in Memphis, Johnny Cash, Patsy Cline, and the Nashville Sound. Email us at letitrollpodcast@gmail.com. Pop in those earbuds and enjoy.
It's time to let it roll. I'm your host, Nate Wilcox. I'm joined once again by James Porter, which means we're continuing our discussion of Ken Burns' documentary series, Country Music. Tonight we're talking about country, episode number 4, I Can't Stop Loving You, 1953 to 1963. James, welcome.
How you doing?
Doing well. This is a big one. Rock and roll comes along and just blows a big old hole in the side of the country ship.
Scares country establishment for a minute, but they bounce back.
This they do. And Burns starts with the funeral of Jimmy Rogers, or not the funeral of Jimmy Rogers, but the 20th anniversary of the death of Jimmy Rogers, which was a big celebration in his hometown of Meridian, Mississippi. Some 20,000 people show up. The Carter family reunites, the original, with AP and Sarah and Maybelle. The Monroe brothers bury their hatchet for one day to reunite for this show. And to me, it was like really a reminder of how near in time this era was to the beginnings of country music. It had only been 20 years since Jimmy Rogers died, and it had only been a few weeks since the funeral of Hank Williams, which drew a comparable crowd in Alabama just before. And they open the episode with Whisper and Bill Anderson talking about how country is a family and we're brought together by hardship, blah, blah, blah. And doesn't really indicate why they're doing that until the end of the episode, which ends in tragedy with the death of Patsy Cline, Hawkshaw Hawkins, and Cowboy Copas in a plane crash in March of 1963. I hope there's no spoilers out there for anybody didn't know about Patsy. What did you make of the way they structured this episode and the juxtapositions of the different stories?
Be honest with you, I mean, that's kind of Ken Burns' way, because he's been doing weird juxtapositions like that all throughout the series, and I hope that's not a spoiler. But I think by the time they got around to this, I was kind of used to it. You know what I mean? He did get around to, like, I know it's very dramatic, as you just said, like, having everybody start out talking about, like, country stars united in tragedy, and we don't find out until the end. But that's just kind of typical Burns. You know what I mean?
Yeah. He's laying the groundwork. He's keeping the narrative thread moving, pulling you through the story. And, some people can complain that this or that favorite gets left out. And in this episode, definitely Don Gibson gets really short shrift. He's, one of the early pioneers of the countrypolitan Nashville sound. He's only mentioned in the context of writing the massive, what Ray Charles turns into a massive pop hit, and I Can't Stop Loving You. Jim Reeves, another countrypolitan king, gets pretty short shrift, barely gets mentioned. Roy Orbison, who recorded his monument hits of the early 60s there in Nashville, is on camera, is on screen, and is heard, but isn't mentioned by name. So, there's definitely, I think, some grounds for people being left out. But you and I talked about the one big name that got left out that indisputably, I think, should have been mentioned.
Johnny Horton.
Absolutely. And they have multiple opportunities to bring him up. Not only does he die in a tragic car wreck in this period, and was a solid honky-tonk singer before he reaches fame in this story song era that we'll talk about in a minute. So that was, and it's kind
also to be mentioned that he wasn't, of all the old guard country guys, he wasn't afraid of rockabilly.
Oh, definitely.
He kind of met that head on, to be honest with you. I think he kind of figured, that he was going to have to make some visual changes, because they didn't talk about this in the special, but I'm talking about Johnny Horton in relation to country music and how it was about to, like, you know, have a big crossover success. It's like when he was doing rockabilly, he was still, you know, wearing a suit and a cowboy hat, you know. And I think as soon as like Elvis kind of went in and kind of like rearranged things, I think, you know, I think the new rock and roll audience was going to go for, like, you know, an old country singer unless he was handsome as Elvis. So I think that's about a time that he took off the hat, got a hairpiece, and got a suit, and he gradually, no, really, you know,
I know.
You know, he kind of gradually makes the transition from, I mean, because what I like about Johnny Horton is, I guess for me, like I probably told you before, I got into country through rockabilly. And there were a number of songs that Johnny Horton did, you know, where you can hardly tell where the rockabilly ends and the country begins, because the fusion is seamless, you know. And then he moves on to the story songs. And because of this is why he really should have been dealt with more than he had been, because he was a crossover king. He was on American Bandstand, you know, he had Dick Clark shows, you know, and songs like The Ballad of New Orleans, Sing to Bismarck, they was big on the pop charts, they were on the country charts.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, they try to cover that by talking about Marty Robbins, who obviously had the massive hit with El Paso. And they had used him earlier to stand in for country artists who dabbled in rock and roll successfully. And Marty Robbins definitely did that with White Sport Coat and A Pink Carnation,
right,
which charted really high on the pop charts. And you know, between these two phases, as his first rockabilly pop phase, and Marty Robbins honestly was more pop rock than rockabilly, although he did some rockabilly numbers. And then he comes back with the story song with El Paso. So, you know, again, they like to use people that they can touch multiple bases with, like, and they also like to tell stories that they can continue from episode to episode. They kind of use this Carter family, Johnny Cash and the Carter Cash dynasty as a thread through the whole series. And another one,
the funny part is you talk about people who, like, you know, covered multiple what was the expression you used? Who covered multiple bases. I mean, it's like, I hate to keep bringing this up, but Johnny Horton, I mean, he was all over the place back in the late 50s, early 60s, you know, and they just kind of overlooked him altogether, you know? Yeah.
They cut him right out. And I mean, I can kind of see why, because again, those story songs he did were bigger on the pop charts, I think, than the country charts. But anyway, that's, you know, I think overall, though, they do quite a good job. The first time I watched it, I was pretty irked because I didn't catch the Don Gibson reference. And I have a soft spot for Don Gibson. And I started with Don Gibson with Neil Young's version of Oh Lonesome Me. And,
yeah,
you know, the weird thing about Don Gibson is so many of these guys like Jim Reeves and others were staples of country oldies radio when I was growing up, but I almost never heard Don Gibson songs. And so for me, going back and rediscovering Don Gibson's catalog, which is stacked, you know, was a real treat. But let's get back to the narrative of the episode. So they start, right, you know, they start with the Jimmy Rogers event, and then they quickly segue to Memphis. And they have to talk about Elvis Presley, who's a weird figure in country music history because he comes out of the country music business. I mean, he's on Sun Records, which was kind of an R&B label, but really is more of a nothing label. I mean, it was a really insignificant label when Elvis first gets on there. But he starts out touring with country acts. He's opening up for people like Slim Whitman, for Hank Snow, touring with these country acts, and starts out on the Louisiana Hayride after a one-time appearance on the Grand Ole Opry. And, you know, obviously his first single was one half a cover of a Arthur Big Boy Crudup blues song. Another half was a rocked up 4/4 version of Bill Monroe's Blue Moon of Kentucky. And so, you know, Elvis is obviously coming out of a country context just because there isn't really any other place for him to go. He's too wild for pop. He's too ethnic for pop, too country, too black. Nobody knew what to make of this. It's really a whole.
And obviously, he couldn't really make it in R&B because, I mean, Johnny Ray, notwithstanding, the era of Blue Eyed Soul Brothers hadn't really come yet.
No.
You know, so somebody like an Elvis Presley working at Chitlin Circuit would have been unheard of in 1955. You know.
Yes, absolutely. And let's go ahead and hear our first song. And this one is Brenda Lee, who they used as a sort of stand-in for these country artists who go rockabilly and take that path into the pop charts. So here's a early track from Brenda Lee, Let's Jump the Broomstick.
Come a little baby, let's jump the broomstick. Come and let's tie a knot. Father don't like it, my brother don't like it, my sister don't like it, my mother don't like it. Come a little baby, let's jump the broomstick. Come and let's tie a knot. Going to Alabama, back from Texarkana. Going all around the world. I'm going to Alabama, back from Texarkana. Going all around the world. My father don't like it, my brother don't like it.
And that was Brenda Lee's Let's Jump the Broomstick, which is a track that she put out right before she exploded. One of your picks, James. Sweet choice. I really dug this song. And Brenda Lee, is one who gets a lot of screen time in this one. And we talked about this offline, and it's easy to say, what the heck? She was, more of a pop figure than a country figure. She had some very minor chart action in the country charts in the 50s. Almost nothing in the 60s, and then comes in the 70s and has a string of hits in the mid 70s on the country charts and tours in the country environment. But I see what they're doing with her is, on the one hand, she's a classic example of an artist who was from a country background, who, had it not been for Elvis and rock and roll, would have clearly been in the country marketplace, who went pop. But she's also somebody who knew Patsy Cline, who was friends with Patsy Cline, who toured with Mel Tillis and George Jones and the Carter sisters in this era. So she's a perfect person to tell some of these stories. And I think because she's close to Patsy Cline, and I think because they couldn't get Loretta Lynn, she's a great person on camera. What do you think of the way they included Brenda Lee in this?
It was kind of, I didn't object to seeing her, but I remember thinking at the time that, to me, including Brenda Lee would be like including Roy Orbison. There was a country influence there, that you can't deny, and they both Orbison and Lee had country influence to an extent. However, though, like I said before, at least, when we're talking off, when we're talking earlier this week, it's like, if you judge Brenda Lee solely by her country success, then she becomes a minor figure all of a sudden, because she was just as much R&B as she was rock and roll. Because the first two LPs had a serious, for a 13-year-old white girl from the South, those first two albums she did on Decca had like a serious R&B influence. It always seems to be overlooked. And I think after I'm Sorry became a hit, then Decca Records kind of like, eased her into the ballad market, and she never really lost the country thing or the R&B thing, 100%. Because even by like 1969 or so, she had like the sort of like country politan hit with a song called Johnny One Time. She always kind of kept, she always kept some kind of ties with that field. But just the same, I've always welcomed to see her. And I'll admit, seeing her on that special made me want to dig out that second self-titled Brenda Lee LP with Let's Jump the Broomstick. This is a great record overall, but it did seem, I would have expected more for Wanda Jackson to be in that spot than Brenda Lee. And that's not casting stones, either Brenda or Wanda. It's just that, it's kind of expected for me. Yeah.
Yeah, but they did give Wanda Jackson some screen time, showed her performing, doing a great fake out where she introduces Hard-Headed Woman as one of the great love songs of our time. And also some footage of her playing with Bob Wills and the Texas Playboys, which is just crazy to imagine. Like, the look on Bob Wills' face as he's standing behind Wanda Jackson is pretty interesting. For sure. And also one thing I want to mention was they talk a little bit about Bill Monroe being resistant to Elvis's version of Blue Moon of Kentucky. And they quote Charlie Daniels, who was a young bluegrass partisan at the time, as, really being pissed off about the change. And I have no doubt that was true. And Charlie Daniels obviously turned around and accepted the rock and roll. And Marty Stewart tells a story about how, Bill Monroe was grumpy about it until he got the royalty check. But I've read in other places that Bill Monroe, when he met Elvis at the Grand Ole Opry, immediately dug the 4/4 version of Blue Moon of Kentucky and immediately taught his band how to play it and quickly recorded his own version of it as a 4/4 rather than a waltz time song. So kind of curious about that. But it's a good way, I think, to explain the sort of shock and resistance of elements to the country audience. Like, they've got Bill C. Malone, the author of Country Music USA, who's the Shelby Foote or Sidney Crouch of this series, the kind of brains behind it that Ken Burns uses as his model. And Bill Malone talks about seeing Elvis open up for Hank Snow, who was his favorite at the time. And Hank had to cut his set short so Elvis could do a second set. And Bill Malone was like, this is the beginning of the end of the music that I love. So, a lot of people really recognize what was happening. And they talk about, the number of country radio stations went from like 600 in 1954 to less than 85 by the end of the decade. So this is just a devastation in the country marketplace. And there's not really anything else analogous to this. I mean, obviously a lot of pop singers were displaced, but the pop market itself was not hurt. R&B, there was a generational shift. We talked before about how people like Louis Jordan were kind of left behind when the hard R&B and rock and roll stuff came out. But R&B wasn't displaced. I mean, people like Little Richard just moved up to the pop charts and maintained their status in the R&B world. Chuck Berry, another example. I also thought it was cool that the first song they play is Maybelline by Chuck Berry, which is a country song all the way. I mean, it's a rewrite of Bob Wills' version of the traditional Ida Red, but they don't mention Chuck by name. But they do talk, when the Ray Charles section comes in, because 1962 has his massive pop success with his album Modern Sounds in Country and Western, which wasn't marketed through the country marketplace. It was marketed as a pop record, but he made it up front, Modern Sounds in Country and Western. And I just love that. I love Vince Gill talking about how proud country people were that somebody like Ray Charles had taken their music and brought it to this massive audience. And he talks about Ray Charles as somebody, to hang your hat on. And for me personally, this is just sentimental. Like as a Gen Xer, Ray Charles is like my granddad or something. I mean, I have those feelings for him, and there's just this period of time, anybody that's our age can remember Ray Charles was just there. I mean, he was there on The Tonight Show. He was there on The Merv Griffin Show. He was there on the TV specials. He was just there, and everybody liked him. If you were born after a certain year, Ray Charles, like you said, he was always there. He was always like the father figure. You'd never known a world without him, and you never thought there'd ever be a world without him. He's like, he's eternal. Yep. And it's really also there's a couple things, regarding Ray Charles. It's like at a time when there were no black country singers and the Civil Rights Bill hadn't even passed, and Ray Charles couldn't even pee in the same John as Don Gibson. It was kind of amazing that Nashville music establishment would give a black man his props. I think that's beautiful. And I think the money was talking.
yeah. But the funny part is, he wasn't even the first. I don't know if I've discussed this before, and I don't mean to take away from Ray Charles, but a year before Modern Sounds and Country Western music came out, Brooke Benton had an LP called something like the Boll Weevil song. The Boll Weevil song. Huh?
You talked about that last episode.
Yes. Yeah.
And Arthur Alexander, I was thinking about that too. He has a number of R&B charts hits around the same period that are totally country songs, and but made no dent on the country market. And it wasn't until the Beatles and the Rolling Stones covered his stuff that most white Americans paid any mind to Arthur Alexander. But it is totally interesting. But I think the thing with Ray Charles was he was so big, and that album and that single was just so big, nobody could ignore it. And I like Willie Nelson's quote that Ray Charles did more for country than any other artist ever. And so I think just the magnitude of his success. I mean, can you imagine what Don Gibson's royalty checks were on that? I Can't Stop Loving You. And so I think Nashville has always responded to money.
This kind of reminded me of something. You were mentioning Don Gibson. This is so weird. It's a little bit of a diversion, but it hooks into what we're talking about just the same. I was once watching a documentary about Ray Charles on PBS, and one of the talking head interviewees was Billy Joel. And Billy Joel was talking about the same topic we're talking about now. Still there?
Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So anyway, so it's like, I actually dropped the phone there. Excuse me. But anyway, what happened was Billy Joel was talking about "I Can't Stop Loving You," and it's, you know, evolution from a country song to an R&B song, you know, and he'd evidently never heard the original because he started going to this is Billy Joel talking, you know, he says that because when "I Can't Stop Loving You" was a country song, it originally sounded like, and he does this really terrible prime time TV, you know, Andy Griffith imitation of a country singer. "I can't stop loving you, do do do. It's easy to say, do 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 do." You know, and he's trying to make it look like the country version is inferior to what Ray Charles did. And I was kind of insulted watching that because Don Gibson was a, for lack of a better term, he was a rural sophisticate. He sounded nothing like that.
Yeah,
I mean, he was like, because Ray Charles recorded several Don Gibson songs, and there was a certain urbane quality to Don Gibson's songs. He wasn't just some hasty, you know, singing out of tune. I mean, his stuff was like, you know, I mean, I don't want to use the word urbane again, but
it was the countrypolitan sound. I mean, it was
right.
Chet Atkins perfecting that Nashville sound. That was, you know, one of the responses to rock and roll. But it's time to cue another song, and this brings up a subject switch. So let's hear this song. This is "Success" from Loretta Lynn, and when we come back, we'll talk about Loretta and Patsy Cline and women in country in this period. And that was "Success" by Loretta Lynn, another one recorded just on the cusp of her big explosion. And Loretta Lynn and Patsy Cline are two of the other central figures in this. And it's totally appropriate because Loretta was absolutely Patsy's protege. They tell the story of how Patsy Cline took her under her wing. Patsy Cline was in the hospital recovering from a car crash, the one that scarred her head so badly. And Loretta was on Ernest Tubbs' late night radio show, broadcasting from his radio station across the alley from the Ryman Auditorium. Patsy Cline hears it in the hospital, sends her husband to bring Loretta Lynn back and meet her, and then just takes her under her wing. And Patsy Cline's a figure, of course, in Coal Miner's Daughter, the book and the movie, and very well known that she had a mentor-protege relationship with Loretta Lynn. Very different performers, though. Loretta Lynn is very, very, very country, whereas Patsy Cline is both somebody who, with Walking After Midnight, kind of flirted with rockabilly, and then in her early 60s run on Decca with Owen Bradley producing, really epitomizes and probably the pinnacle of the Nashville sound and the countrypolitan vibe. And
I probably said before, she was kind of like a female Charlie Rich, you know?
Yeah. Oh yeah. That's a good comparison because her voice is so rich and she can do so many different things. And
right.
And Patsy is kind of the Jimmy Rogers or Hank Williams of this episode. She's another comet who's only in this one episode because her life was cut short at 30 with the plane crash. And it seemed like, you know, death was nibbling at her toes with that car wreck she had just a year or so, maybe 18 months before she died. So, or maybe two and a half years. But yeah, it's poignant to me. I mean, I'm somebody who grew up, my big sister used to go through these phases where she'd get down over some boyfriend dumping her or whatever and would really, really get into the Patsy Cline. And you know, we grieved together a lot, my sister and I, and Patsy Cline, you know, was right up there with Jim Croce. And so, you know, there's that we cried about together. So, you know, the end of the episode in particular is poignant, although they focus on Hawkshaw Hawkins as kind of the center of that. And I guess that's because his widow, Jeannie Shepherd, is still alive. And his story is, you know, he's kind of the Big Bopper of the country version of The Day the Music Died. I mean, he's the second or third guy in the car in the plane crash along with Patsy and Cowboy Copas. And he had his one hit released right before the plane crash, and he makes number one posthumously. Great story and a great singer. Another guy who I went back and listened to quite a few of his tunes after listening to this episode. Well worth it. I mean, Hawkshaw Hawkins was one of those guys that should have made it sooner. And it was just fate, and it was a heavy fate that he got on the plane with Patsy Cline after doing a benefit in Kansas City. And that's where the whole country music was a family thing, because they were a whole bunch of performers went to Kansas City to do a benefit for a DJ who had just passed away in a car crash. And, Hawkshaw and Cowboy Copas flew back with Patsy Cline a day later. Hawkshaw gave up his seat on a commercial airline for a friend whose father was ill. So, yeah, it's heavy duty stuff, and it's a good way to end the episode, and I think a good way to cover a number of things, because Patsy Cline also performed songs written by Willie Nelson. And Willie Nelson's Crazy, #1 jukebox hit of all time. So that's how they bring in the whole Nashville songwriter thing. They talk about the Bryants, and they talk about how their partnership with the Everly Brothers was a huge thing, which gives them an excuse to bring in the Louvin Brothers briefly. But really, Willie Nelson, they talk about Mel Tillis and Roger Miller. They mention Hank Cochran and Harlan Howard, who also wrote hits for Patsy Cline. But really, Willie Nelson is the stand-in for this new generation of songwriters that's hanging out at Tootsie's Orchid Lounge and writing songs and selling them in Nashville in this period.
So yeah, it is interesting, the little slight generational shift,
Yeah.
So,
And it's part of Nashville becoming Music City, and they talk about that too. And again, they focus on the producers, Chet Atkins at RCA, and Owen Bradley, who, with his brother Harold, who is also a session guitarist, built the studio. They don't mention Jim Beck, but they do mention that Decca was about to move all their country recording to Dallas. And there was a guy in Dallas who was cutting records in this period, Jim Beck, and he died right around this time. So they don't mention that. They mention that the Bradleys built the studio and convinced Decca to stay in Nashville. They don't mention that their #1 competitor conveniently died around this time. But this is definitely one of those forks in the road, because the gravitational center of country music could very easily have moved to Dallas if Decca had made that decision. Mm-hmm. Another thing they talk about is the Jordanaires and the Anita Kerr singers, the backup singers that are a big part of this Countrypolitan sound. And let's take a break, hear from our sponsors, and when we come back, we'll talk more the ups and downs of the Countrypolitan Nashville sound. Right. And so before that sponsor break, I was mentioning that, these smooth background singers like the Jordanaires, who most famous for backing up Elvis Presley on many recordings, but also the Anita Kerr singers, who backed up a ton of records. And those kind of 50s choral background voices, this was a huge part of the whole Mitch Miller sound of the early 50s, a big part. You hear it on Georgia Gibbs records, Patti Page records. This was a signature pop sound of the 50s. And honestly, not having lived through the 50s, I still like that sound. I don't have anything against those background singers. It doesn't bother me at all, but a lot of people, it really sets their teeth on edge. What's your take on the whole country?
Well, my take on it, it's a case-by-case basis, I gotta be honest with you. Some labels did it better than others. I think Columbia and Decca's Countrypolitan records are pretty good. And I know it's blasphemy to say, but Lefty Frizzell did a 1964 remake of "If You've Got the Money, I Got the Time."
Yep.
On a greatest hits album, so it'll be in stereo, right? And it's got this kind of Mitch Miller sing-along chorus behind him. If you got the money, I got time. What's the time? It sounds really outlandish, but I kind of like it. It kind of gives gives a song a new kick. But while I like, the Countrypolitan records that are coming out, I know I'm sounding really technical here, so you have to pardon me, but the reason I like the Countrypolitan records that Owen Bradley did for Decca, and I guess it was Don Law who did the same kind of records for Columbia, is because they still had a kick. I mean, they might have had the Jordanaires or whoever, but they also had like a Sting electric guitar, and they also had a hard backbeat because they kind of knew they had to get the rock and roll kids, right? However, Chet Atkins at RCA was a lot more middle of the road. He wasn't rock so much as pop, so there were a lot of rough edges that were smoothed over and kind of missed, and I think, just the mere fact that, I know we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves, but I think Waylon Jennings and Willie Nelson, those two artists, two rugged individualists, who they tried to fit into into the RCA formula, and it didn't always take, and when both men, I mean, in Willie's case, he left the label altogether. And in Waylon's case, he started recording in LA, then he started recording with his own band to get away from all that, and those like two examples of why, the countrypolitan thing, wasn't really made for everybody.
And Chet, he was involved in the Everly Brothers kind of early on, and was involved in producing some of their hits, I think, although I had a harder time tracking that down, but I knew that he had been involved with them early. And, he obviously produced Don Gibson and struggled with him through the whole pill problem that Don Gibson developed, after his massive success. And so I absolutely get what you're saying, and I agree. Owen Bradley is the stronger producer, but Chet did produce a lot of good stuff, although, again, boy, did Waylon Jennings struggle with him. I think it is. I think it's becoming clear over time that Owen Bradley and others did the Nashville sound better than Chet Atkins did. But, Chet got his licks in for sure, and was a big deal. And bringing up Lefty, I'm glad you brought that up, because that Lefty Frizzell greatest hits from the mid-'60s, where he re-records all his 50s, that was the first Lefty album I ever owned. And that made me really...
The remakes are shockingly good.
Oh, yeah, Lefty's in fine form. But like you say, if you're a hardcore country person, especially if you grew up on the original hardcore honky-tonk versions from the early 50s, I can see where those are heresy. But for me, that was the first version I heard. I really love that stuff. And Lefty comes back in this episode. Last time he was going toe-to-toe with Hank Williams for, a heady 18 months. And then he really struggled in the rock and roll era, although he tried to adapt to rockabilly, but he just didn't hit. But then he comes back in the story song phase, and they mention the thing how old songs and new old songs were a big part of this. And Long Black Veil is a classic. It was written to order to be a fake folk song, but it pulls it off. And Lefty's the perfect singer for it, and it's a massive, massive hit for Lefty, and really epitomizes that story song. And another thing they do that I thought was neat, and something I didn't know, was that they introduced this story song era by talking about the Kingston Trio, who, I mean, of course, I was aware of their massive success in the late 50s with this collegiate brand of quote unquote folk music, descended from the Pete Seeger Weavers school, which we talked about in a previous episode of how that kind of folk bifurcated, and folk music became something that originated out of New York City. And that's their tradition. The Kingston Trio were coming out on, and their song Tom Dooley won the Grammy Award for the Country Music Performance of the Year, which, I mean, if Charlie Rich was pissed about Olivia Newton-John getting the CMA award, people must have been just pulling their teeth out when the Kingston Trio won the Grammy Award. I mean, but it just goes to show the music business didn't know what to make of folk yet, because even though the Weavers had the massive success in the early 50s, they got blacklisted pretty quickly, and kind of, to me, got lumped in with things like Tony Bennett doing Cold Cold Heart, or Patti Page's version of Tennessee Waltz is just part of that weird period where 3-chord country songs were a big part of the pop scene for a little while, and then that changed, and the Weavers get blacklisted and kept their appeal. They kept the cult audience, and then they reunite and do the big show at Carnegie Hall, and then the Kingston Trio just explodes as this massive, massive pop phenomenon. And I have to think it was people who were college students in the late 50s, so they were kids who were buying records in the Weaver's heyday in the early 50s and listening to Johnny Ray and buying How Much Is That Doggy in the Window and all that stuff. So it's the pre-rock and roll generation that was the Kingston Trio fan base, and they're kind of...
I would think so, because you notice the Kingston Trio didn't really make the transition to folk rock.
No, definitely not.
I mean, the Beatles made a lot of things passé, and the Kingston Trio was one of them.
Yes.
Yeah.
Whereas people like Peter, Paul, and Mary, who come along a little later, managed to keep having hits all through the 60s, although they never really go folk rock either, other than their parody song, Slamming the Mamas and the Papas. But that's
But they were still selling records though, so they were obviously on top of something.
Yeah. They had Leaving on a Jet Plane and all that kind of stuff. So let's hear another song, and this is Johnny Cash's stab at the story song genre, and this is Johnny Cash with "Don't Take Your Guns to Town."
Billy Joe grew restless on the farm, a boy filled with wanderlust who really meant no harm. He changed his clothes and shined his boots and combed his dark hair down, and his mother cried as he walked out, "Don't take your guns to town, son, leave your guns at home, Bill. Don't take your guns to town."
And that was Johnny Cash, "Don't Take Your Guns to Town," which is his entry into the story song stakes, right up there. They talk about El Paso by Marty Robbins in that genre. I don't think they mentioned Jimmy Dean's Big Bad John by name, but they do mention that one year, I think it was 59, 6 out of the top 10 country songs that year were story songs. So there was something in the American consciousness as the 50s turned into the 60s that wanted to hear these sort of faux traditional story songs. And it was a big deal. And Johnny's right in there. But the thing I want to talk about with Johnny is the way they tell his personal story. They use his personal story both as a stand-in for Elvis and Sun Records. It's a way to bring Carl Perkins in there because there's the great story about Johnny suggesting the title Blue Suede Shoes to Carl Perkins as a song idea, and Carl Perkins suggesting I'll Walk the Line as the song title for Johnny. And then they tell the story about Johnny wrote that song, I Walk the Line, for his first wife, Vivian. And then, Roseanne Cash tells that story. Then she laughs and says, of course, he didn't walk the line. He wasn't true to her. And then that brings in the whole Ring of Fire as the other song they kind of frame the Johnny Cash segment with. So they have 3 different segments in the episode about Johnny Cash. And Ring of Fire, of course, is the song June Carter wrote about falling in love with Johnny Cash illicitly in their affair. Her sister Anita had cut a version, which I hadn't been aware of before this show, that they played. And it's a really nice version. Anita Carter's a great singer, but when you hear the Johnny Cash version with those Mexican, trumpets, just this massive, massive hit as part of his massive, massive country and pop success in the early 60s.
Production he ever got too.
Yeah. It's sweet production. And they use Johnny, I think, pretty well to tell those stories and also just to hook people in on these narratives. They did the same thing with Sarah Carter and her love for Coy Bays in the second episode. So this Carter Cash dynasty, they're telling their story of their lives and loves all the way through this as a narrative hook, which I think is great. I mean, the goal of a documentary like this is to expand beyond country music nerds like us and get into just regular folks who are turning on their TV and want to see a story that's compelling.
Right.
And
I think they did have about dumbing it down. I know that some people might argue with me about that because I had some pretty loaded Facebook conversations about that when the show was actually running. For every person who thought it was well done, there was always they missed Hugh X. Lewis, so it can't be all that good, or that they skipped over Henson Cargill, so it can't be all that great, but it's really, in general, it's like, there was some very egregious omissions like Johnny Horton, as we discussed earlier, and of course Conway Twitty, which might come up later.
Yeah, we'll come next time, although he is mentioned in this episode. And also, they did mention Roy Orbison by name in the context when they listed people like him and Conway Twitty that are in the acolytes of Elvis following along in the wake. But they didn't mention Roy's name when they played his big hits that he was cutting in Nashville a few years later. But yeah, again.
And another thing
go ahead.
Too, that I thought about as well. It's like, it's almost like there's an alternate reality where Elvis is really a country singer, who goes pop, and Johnny Cash is really a rock singer who goes country. And if you think about it, like, even though like Elvis is the rocker and Johnny is the country guy, they've always had followings in each other's fields.
Yeah.
Johnny Cash is always like what I call like the token country singer in a rock band's collection.
Yep.
And there was a TV special he hosted like in the early 70s where he had on like, all these rock stars. Yeah. Like not only that, but a later special he had where he had like Neil Young on singing the Neil the Damage Done. He had on Tony Joe White, James Taylor, and Linda Ronstadt.
Yeah.
And I think during the hippie era, even though he didn't really identify either Republican or Democrat, he did kind of reach out to the hippie market in ways that, Merle Haggard wouldn't have done.
Yes.
At least not. Yeah.
Absolutely. And speaking of Merle Haggard, they bring him up because, legendarily, Johnny plays at San Quentin in this period, and Merle Haggard's one of the prisoners who decides, I'm going to straighten my life out. If I get out of this jail, I'm going to be a singer like Johnny Cash. And it's a great way to tell the Johnny Cash story because, Merle Haggard was still alive when they made this, so he could get on camera and talk about it. And it's also that narrative thread. It sets up for the next episode because Merle's going to be a big part of it next week. And it's also, that's kind of the magic of Johnny Cash, because I know exactly what you're saying, like his Rick Rubin albums in the 90s, and he played emos here in Austin. I saw that show, and,
right.
Just legendary stuff, but definitely was the rock fans.
There are people right now who say that, the Rick Rubin LPs are kind of like a weird sellout because they're trying to make them do like 9 Inch Nails, the Depeche Mode songs. I'm like, well, hey, where were you back in the 60s when you was like, hanging out with like Bob Dylan?
Exactly.
And Neil Young, and
yep.
he always had the origin, and even the 50s. I mean, at first, because he was like probably one of the few country singers, the only country singer really of the 50s who didn't use a fiddle and steel on his records. And then he wore all black when everybody else was wearing like, multicolored crap, So, I mean, in the context of 1956, I can see how he could easily pass for rock and roll when he was still on Sun.
Yeah, definitely. Hey Porter and others, I mean, really fit in with rockabilly all the way. And Elvis, had later hits with things like Kentucky Rain and, played a lot of Jerry Reed songs, Guitar Man and others. And I think the country audience that Elvis just frankly stole from the country industry never left him. And country people always loved Elvis, although he and Colonel Parker were very careful to never market him as a country artist and really limited the number of country songs he could do. Because I think they knew that his status as a pop musician was tenuous just because he was a cracker hillbilly redneck, from the sticks and came along in this one window of time when these young country guys, because of their absorption of black music, seemed so new and novel and were obviously not backward hillbillies, that they were on the cutting edge and leading American culture for this brief moment. And he seized that moment and he held that. But this interrelationship of Elvis and country is still a fraught relationship, even the way they handle it in this episode, where they have to talk about Elvis because, he comes out of the country business and his impact on it was so huge. But like they get Bill Anderson to say, at first we didn't know what to make of Elvis. He's doing a country song. He's doing an R&B song. He's, kind of alternating back and forth through the Sun area. Then he does Don't Be Cruel and he's gone. He's off being a pop star, and Johnny Cash stayed with us. And, they quote somebody else saying that, Elvis was never really a country singer, but Johnny Cash always was. And so, there's definitely could be a parallel universe where the two of them flip places. But I want to play our last song and then come back and talk a little bit more about Loretta Lynn, because there's a great Merle Haggard quote I want to get to. But let's hear Patsy Cline's Faded Love. This is a Bob Wills song that she recorded right before she died. It didn't come out until after her death. This is Patsy Cline's Faded Love.
Letters that you wrote to me, it's you that I am thinking of as I read the lines that to me were so dear. I remember our fate.
And that was Patsy Cline doing Bob Wills' classic Faded Love. And that and Sweet Dreams were her posthumous single, and just massive, massive hits. And anytime a star goes out on top like that and has a new album, a new single in the can, of course it's going to be a massive hit. But I think those songs have held up over time. But I don't have so much to say about Patsy, but her protege, Loretta Lynn, they tell the story of how Loretta, the classic, I mean, this is the coal miner's daughter story of, very young girl from Butcher Holler, Kentucky, coal mining town, who marries young to Doolittle at age 14. And, in our Me Too era, that kind of stuff is really frowned on. It was not ideal back then. And she has these four.
About that.
Oh, yeah. And they tell the story of how she had the four kids quickly and got a hold of a guitar and would force the kids to sit there and listen to her sing and everything. But I thought Merle Haggard put it really well when he said, he's talking about her first single, Honky Tonk Girl, that was financed by a fan who'd seen her playing in a Tacoma, Washington honky tonk, and gets this single out. And, Loretta and Mooney famously barnstorm around the radio stations all over the country getting it to play. And Merle Haggard says she wanted out of that life she was in, and she kind of sang her way out of prison. And coming from Merle, I thought that was really insightful and kind of a feminist take. And also, that was his story, too. He sang his way out of prison. And I think that's one of the secret powers of country music, is it's a way for poor people to sing their way out of the circumstances of their lives.
That's just universal, kind of like, the Velvet Underground songs. Her life was saved by rock and roll. There is a country equivalent,
Yep, absolutely. And that happens totally in Loretta's story. And then last couple things I want to get to. I did mention Ronnie Milsap. They used Ronnie Milsap to talk about Ray Charles and his country success, which is totally appropriate, because as much as I grew up in the 80s thinking of Ronnie Milsap as one of these pop country guys I couldn't stand, and that somebody that I was so happy when people like Randy Travis and George Strait kind of blew him off the radio. But as I've learned more and I've listened to Ronnie's early stuff, he's a Memphis R&B guy who entered the country market really because he didn't have anywhere else to go. And as a blind musician, of course, Ray Charles is a big role model to him. So I thought it was really sweet that they let Ronnie Milsap speak for Ray, and really fitting, and
I was kind of like you. It's like, I kind of came along to Ronnie Milsap, through the back rows myself. So I thought it was like a corny 80s country singer that, the Randy Travis got rid of. However, in the 2000s, at the magazine where I was working for, I received a compilation of Ronnie's greatest hits back, and right after that, I went to see him live. And I gotta say, listen to those songs one after another and seeing them live. The R&B influence is audible. It's kind of candy coated, but it kind of gives like a little bit more grit than say Lee Greenwood. You know what I mean?
Oh, 100%.
It's not immediately evident, but it's there, and that's kind of why he might go down a lot easier with you and me than Lee Greenwood. But yeah.
Yeah, he's sort of like Charlie Rich, a lesser Charlie Rich for sure, but somebody who had such a blend, and the R&B was such a big part of their music that they kind of had to struggle to find their way, to find a commercial path to get that. But I love the triumph in his voice when he's bragging on Ray Charles, and he's, Ray knew what the pulse of America was all about. And these songs that tell a story, that's what country music's about. And then Rhiannon Giddens of the Carolina Chocolate Drops has a great quote in this about the Ray Charles doing the Don Gibson song to massive success. And she says, the best things in American music are always a mix. One of the reasons American music has taken over the world is because everybody can feel that it comes from 1 + 1 = 100, that there's this multiplying effect when Americans of different backgrounds, African Americans and Scots-Irish Americans mix these heritages. The synergy is just massive. And I'd never heard it put that way. And the way she expressed it, one of the reasons American music took over the world in the 20th century, because everybody can feel that it's a mix. And it's a mix that the people, the city fathers of Nashville, who didn't even like country music, definitely did not want taking place. It's something that the powers that be in America never wanted any part of. And another thing that they bring up in this episode that I'd really never thought about before was the Italian-Americanness of Felice and Boudleaux Bryant. Boudleaux wasn't Italian-American, but his wife Felice was Sicilian. And they would tell the story of how they would pitch their songs over these Italian spaghetti dinners. And as somebody from Texas who grew up in places without good Italian food, it's such a treat, to get good Italian food. And the thought of, these country singers going and having probably their first ever homemade Sicilian meal. And if you've ever had, never pass up a chance to have a homemade Sicilian meal, my God, and of course they sold songs, fill them up with red wine and spaghetti and then hit them with, some of their excellent songs. So I like that too, because you definitely don't think about Italian Americans as being a big part of the country mix.
Right. You don't. Yeah. Or Jewish either. One of the big country songwriters of this period was a guy named Cy Coleman.
Yeah. And Shel Silverstein later on, who I'm guessing is Jewish. I could be wrong about that, but yeah, there's much, and of course Kinky Friedman comes along a little later and is one of these guys. But yeah, that whole mix. I mean, I've frequently thought, you think about Plato or whatever, and how Plato would talk about how, you should never allow music to change because that'll upset the whole social order if people listen to different music. And at some point in the 50s, the powers that be just abdicated control over American popular music and let Black folks and Jews take over. And I mean, I guess that was just the American devotion to the bottom line and whatever makes a buck. But if you're some kind of evil racist mastermind, that's the last thing you ever would have done is let these, Jews and Black folks and rednecks who are totally dispossessed and despised by the ruling classes. And like that Whispering Bill Anderson quote at the beginning where he talks about country as this us versus them thing. And that immediately gets my back up because my first inclination, even as a redneck myself, is to think, oh, that's some kind of racist thing. That the us and them line is a racial line. But he's not talking about that. He's talking about the social class line, the class line between the people on Music Row, the people that were at the funerals of Patsy Cline and Hawkshaw Hawkins and Cowboy Copas, and the people up in Belmead who resent Nashville becoming the country music capital of the world and want it to stay this Athens of the South. So
Bill Anderson's the guy who wrote the song Po Folks, so he know about the class distinctions,
And yeah, absolutely. And Bill Anderson's another one. Like, this is a guy that I grew up hearing, his Whispering Bill Anderson hits like still and just hated it, and then when I discovered that he wrote so many, Ray Price classics, and he wrote Saginaw, Michigan, and he's just this absolutely essential country songwriter, despite as a singer, I still am not a fan, although I'm kind of morbidly fascinated with those songs where he takes the break in the middle to whisper in a speaking voice and get super sentimental. But
and not only that, but if you talk about music, if you talk about like country music, like race mixing and just like, genre mixing, he actually did like a couple of credible versions of R&B songs down the road. They weren't his biggest hits, but I do know that he did do versions of the Supremes, Someday We'll Be Together, and the Shy-Lights, Have You Seen Her?
Oh my God, I got to track that down.
I mean, he's got pretty big ears, for a countrypolitan guy. I mean, it's like, I reacted the same way as you. It's like, I was over at a friend's house, and I told him that, Bill Anderson never really like made a dent with me because I knew a lot of sappy stuff he did. And he played me a Bill Anderson's Greatest Hits album, the very first one, and I'm like, wow, there's something there. I mean, still kind of wimpy, but maybe it's because he's on Decca, it hit a little bit harder than it had a right to,
Yeah. And I wondered if his limitations as a singer wasn't why he wasn't the one who did City Lights, for example. Maybe it was his career placement. Ray Price was obviously bigger. So it just kind of made me wonder if that Whispering Bill thing was just a way to get around his limitations as a singer. But we also should bring up Ray Price because they talk about him, and it's very important that he was the one guy who wrote out the rockabilly era. Even the Louvin brothers have electric guitars on their records of this period. And Ray Price is keeping the fiddles front and center and totally the representative, the champion of hardcore country through this whole period, with the legendary Texas Shuffle. And so definitely want to mention Ray Price, who
it's pretty damn thing about it, that walking bass.
Yeah. Yeah, it's even as much as that they were talking about, oh, he's Mr. Hardcore Country, and he is with the arrangements. but his songs and his beats are innovative and bringing in this shuffle pattern from the blues. So even Mr. Pure is not quite so pure. And of course, ironically, growing up, my best friend Danny's dad, who had this great 50s record collection, loved Chuck Berry and Hank Williams and George Jones, and introduced us to so much great stuff. And he would tell us about that heartbreaking day when Ray Price sold out and went countrypolitan. And, but the reason that hurt so much is because there was this period in the 50s when Ray Price was absolutely carrying the torch for pure hardcore country and keeping it going. But we'll talk about that 60s period next time when we continue our discussion of Ken Burns Country. Any final thoughts on this episode, James?
I thought it was pretty cool. I mean, this kind of crossover period, always did fascinate me, in a lot of ways. Of course, there are a lot of crossover hits that they only get around to. Like, Big Bad John by Jimmy Dean, who admittedly I wasn't a fan of. I like that song, but most of the other things I've heard by him didn't really like ring any bells for me. But that song and his delivery, was so powerful. And also, like, who else would dare to say the word hell twice on a record in 1961?
Yep. Yep. That was a pretty bold, controversial thing. And I should also mention, I don't know if I mentioned it before, but I talk about Roger Miller, and I also talk about Roger Miller finding the plane wreck that Patsy Cline and Hawkshaw Hawkins were in. I did not know that Roger Miller climbed a forest fire tower in the forest out there west of Nashville and actually led the way to the body. So, yeah, it is this. He
wasn't famous yet, I guess, but I guess the whole Nashville scene knew him as a writer. So, it wasn't unusual for him to go out there like with the other celebrities, like, check out what's going on. Yeah.
Yeah, they knew him from Tootsie's Orchid Lounge. So, and he's going to be a big part of the 60s. And so, it's going to be interesting to discuss how they cover Roger Miller and that whole 60s period. So, James, it's been fun as always, and look forward to next time.
All right, thanks a lot. Later.
Follow the Let It Roll podcast on Twitter at Let It Rollcast, and check out our website at letitrollpodcast.com. Country Roll will be back next week when James and Nate discuss Episode 5, The Sons and Daughters of America, which covers Charlie Pride's efforts to integrate country music, the rise of Roger Miller, Buck Owens and Merle Haggard's Bakersfield sound, Loretta Lynn and the new wave of female singers she led. Let It Roll is a Pantheon podcast, and you can listen to more great podcasts at www.pantheonpodcasts.com.